So the first clock you restore, or first important clock, happens to be one made by John Harrison.
Well,
And your first apprenticeship happens to be with Dr. George Daniels. I mean, this is just crazy.
And Martin Burgess. Martin
Yes.
Burgess, as we mentioned, produced the most accurate mechanical clock ever made, using modern materials, but he used Harrison's principles. So Martin and George are two very remarkable people.
At this point of time, were you aware that you were part of history
Yes.
with these monumental figures? Welcome back to the Collectability Podcast. Today, we are joined by William Andrews. For those of you that know Will already, I know that you are ready to enjoy every minute of this podcast. For those of you that do not yet know Will, I am preparing you for a treat today because he is a vast source of information. He has an incredible world of knowledge, passion, genius, and his quest to always learn more about all things horological and to help others along the way is unmatched. In short, Will is one of the world's leading horologists. He's a historian, clockmaker, inventor, artist, and sundial maker. Before we begin, here is Will's official bio. William Andrews was born and educated in England. He trained as a clockmaker, working under the guidance of George Daniels, Martin Burgess, and others, and as a designer, graduating from Kingston College of Art in 1972. Specializing in the field of time measurement for over 4 decades, he's worked at Eton College, the Old Royal Observatory, Greenwich, the Time Museum, and Harvard University, where he was the David P. Wheatland curator of the collection of historical scientific instruments. He organized famously the Longitude Symposium, edited the Quest for Longitude book, and was co-author with Dava Sobel of the Illustrated Longitude. For his contributions to horology, the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers awarded Will the Harrison Gold Medal in 2007. Will Andrews has been awarded 3 patents for his longitude dial. Examples have been made for clients in Brazil, England, France, Mexico, Spain, and the United States. And perhaps your most appreciative client is the Reardon family. Your dial is literally the centerpiece of our home and, without a doubt, our most precious worldly possession. And more on that later. All of that said, welcome, Will.
Thank you very much, John.
And you know, Will, many great quests start with a story of failure. And the moment of time when something goes terribly wrong that helps you embark on an unexpected adventure. And that's where I'd like to start today.
My failure came in about 1965 when I failed all my O-level exams. And that made me revisit my life. What was I doing? I was doing all the wrong things. I was following along with the pack, studying all the normal things that kids of that age, 15, 16, were studying. I didn't love learning. And it was a real blessing. At first, of course, it's a disaster. You go through a period of saying, why do I want to go on living when you first hear? And then I thought, how selfish, how stupid is that? All kinds of opportunities. And it's that when I got a very good tutor. I went to a school called Bryanston in Dorset. It's a boarding school. And he advised me. He said, what do you enjoy? And so I was led towards the arts and the crafts. And I embarked on a whole new adventure.
So what happened next?
When I was about 16, I suppose, I had a little cuckoo clock. It was a 19th century cuckoo clock, an old one, on the wall, and it hadn't worked for years. And I thought I should get this going. So I took it apart. And of course, my parents were a bit concerned. Would he ever get it back together again? And I got it back together again, and it worked. And then you get the euphoria of completing your first piece, and then you feel you have the strength to do anything. So I embarked on something else, and then I was cleaning an early 18th century bracket clock for my aunt, and I had a problem with the pallets, and I didn't know how to solve it. So I went to the local clock shop, and they took me down, and the master clockmaker there, this was at Knowles Brown in Hampstead. I grew up in Hampstead in north London. And this was a well-established clock shop. Mr. Knowles, the old Mr. Knowles Brown, had been one of the founders of the Antiquarian and Horological Society. Anyway, The clockmaker there was delighted and helped me. And then the owner of the shop said, would you like to come and work with us in the holidays from school? And they were going to pay me £10 a week, that I thought was unbelievably generous. And I loved it. And so I went on working there for about 4 years.
And did that lead to Kingston College eventually?
No, that had nothing to do with Kingston College. It had everything to do with my growing love for horology. After reading a lot of things, life histories, the lives of the artists, so Michelangelo and Raphael and Gainsborough and Constable and others, I was enamored with their lives. And I thought, I should be doing something creative. Why do I want to do anything else? Why do I want to do a normal kind of job? And I was impressed by their stories. And then my father brought back home from Greenwich one day. He'd been there for his brother's 60th birthday, and he came back with a little pamphlet called John Harrison and His Timekeepers by Rupert Gould. And I read this in one sitting and was absolutely taken with it. And so I did a paper on it for art school. And looking back on it, it was terrible. But no one at art school knew anything about clocks or Harrison or anything, so the professor gave me high marks. Well, high marks is the sort of the encouragement you need to keep going. And so that's when I began to sort of look more seriously at horology. And then when I finished my foundation year at art school, which is the general year, and going into the next year when I specialized in furniture design. It was three-dimensional design, but the course was divided into two parts. Furniture design, you actually made the parts that you designed, and interior design, you built models. And I love the idea of building, so I opted for that. And they were very open that furniture could be anything, from a kind of table or a chair to a clock or a music stand or something like that, any kind of thing of that nature. That's when I wrote to Colonel Quill and to Martin Burgess and others. And
so, Will, I don't think you ever told me that this whole journey, this whole horological journey started when your father gave you a pamphlet from John Harrison. So 2 questions. Please share with our audience, who is John Harrison and what did this pamphlet mean for you?
John Harrison, I think, is the most remarkable person in the history of time measurement. He was self-taught. He lived in a very remote part of England, and he overcame all the problems of precision timekeeping. And furthermore, he invented the first successful marine timekeeper. He spent his whole life in pursuit of this problem, and he solved it, and he eventually won the Longitude Prize, which was a £20,000 prize offered by the British government in 1713. The problem of finding longitude at sea was so severe at the time because ships were being lost, and when in 1707 the British fleet, 2 or 3 warships were lost off the Isles of Scilly, the government stepped in and said, we've got to do something about it. It ended up with the Longitude Act being passed in 1714, and that stipulated that if you could solve the problem to within half a degree, whether astronomically or mechanically or any way, you'd be entitled to £20,000. That was a massive sum of money at the time. That was the prize being offered. Harrison devoted his whole life to the problem. When I read his little pamphlet, I was just so taken with the story, and I thought, I've got to do a project from my end of my foundation year at art school, and so I did this little booklet showing pictures and drawings and things like that.
And before you received this pamphlet, did you ever hear of John Harrison before?
I don't know. My aunt may have already sent me the book by Colonel Quill, but I think that was probably my first introduction to him. And it's such a beautifully written pamphlet and really sort of tells the story in a meaningful way. I was so taken with it, I wanted to do this project, and I think it was after that I wrote to Colonel Quill to get more information. He had just published this book about Harrison. He'd taken up the subject. Colonel Quill was a very remarkable man, and he had taken up the study of the subject. Gould died in 1948. Quill took it up around 1950.
So how does Martin Burgess fit into the storyline?
Well, that's a great question. Martin was a most remarkable man. He died about 2 years ago. He was a very dear friend of mine. I met him when I was just 20 and he was 39. And I met him through an article that was published in the Guardian newspaper called Clocks and Goat's Milk. And it was about this remarkable clockmaker who lived out in the country and lived off the farm and devoted his life to clockmaking, sculptural clockmaking, mind you. George Daniels revived the watchmaking industry, and Martin transformed horology into an art form in a very meaningful way, because he found the exciting thing about a clock was in the mechanism. How does it work? And let you get drawn into the mechanism when you see it working.
So you mentioned Dr. George Daniels, and I think our listeners and I am obsessed with all George Daniels stories, and you had some amazing memories with him, to say the least. So how did you end up having tea with George Daniels?
Well, I should step back for tea with Colonel Quill.
Yes.
I wrote to Colonel Quill, and he had no idea how old I was or anything. So he started his first letter, Dear Mr. Andrews. And when he realized I was only 20, it turned to Dear Andrews. But anyway, I went to see him, and he had a Harrison clock. He had he'd found one of Harrison's clocks, and he'd published this great book called John Harrison, the Man Who Found Longitude. I would go and have tea with him, sort of once a month. And on one occasion, we'd only been going there a few months, and he said, Andrews, how would you like to complete a clock that John Harrison never finished? And I was amazed. And my first thing was, how do I do this on my own? And he immediately chimed in and said, no, you're not going to do it on your own. If he likes you, and if you're up to it, I will make sure you're apprenticed to George Daniels.
Wow.
Who I'd never heard of George Daniels before. But every time I heard his name, evidently this was a very remarkable man. And so it ended up with us driving down and seeing the clock. And he said, have you ever used a turns? And thank goodness I said no. But anyway, he said, let me show you. So he showed me how to use the turns and then said, you have a go. Of course, I was very nervous.
What's a turns?
The turns is like a hand lathe. In the film Keeper of Time, you see that wonderful French watchmaker using it.
Yes.
So you're turning the piece with a bow, with a string. You've wrapped it round a little ferrule that keeps it moving backwards and forwards. On every downward stroke, you advance your cutter, and it cuts the material that you're trying to turn. So downward strokes, you advance the cutter. Upward strokes, you take it away.
Okay.
And when you go like that, you can actually turn very quickly. So obviously, it's a lot more difficult to turn steel than brass.
So George Daniels taught you how to do this.
So George not only taught me, but he gave me one of his turns to sort of take home, and gave me a project. He said, come back when you've done it. When I went back, of course, he and Quill went off into a corner and were mumbling away. I was terrified. But anyway, they came back and said, all right, how can you start? And fortunately, I worked out with the art school that I would do this as my thesis, which I had to do at the end of the 4-year course. And I worked under George every Thursday, basically, going to do that, and then did the restoration and did the publication of the story of the restoration.
So the first clock you restore, first important clock, happens to be one made by John Harrison. Well, and your first apprenticeship happens to be with Dr. George Daniels. I mean, this is crazy.
And Martin Burgess. Martin Burgess, as we mentioned, produced the most accurate mechanical clock ever made, using modern materials, but he used Harrison's principles. So Martin and George are two very remarkable people.
At this point of time, were you aware that you were part of history with these monumental figures? You knew it.
My diaries begin in 1970.
Okay.
Because I was only 20, but I needed something to organize my time and everything, because suddenly everything took off in a way that became pretty serious.
Now, I know a lot of our listeners are going to ask this question, so I'm going to ask you now.
Sure.
I'm sure you know Roger Smith, and did you overlap with Roger?
No, it was a long time. It's rather interesting because Roger came at the end, or toward the end of George's life. I think they maybe around 2000, 2001, Roger started to work with him. I basically worked with George between 1970 and 1972. The only other person who had worked with George, as far as I know, was Anthony Randall.
Of course.
Who was a great watchmaker, absolutely superb. But Anthony was being paid by George. I wasn't being paid by George. And that made a huge difference, because when you're being paid by George, George expects you to work as fast as he does. And I've never seen anyone work so fast. And in fact, George very kindly, after a year, he stepped in and said, William, this is taking too long and you're not getting paid and you should get paid. So he enabled me to get some money from the clockmakers company. And he sold me his lathe too. So I bought the lathe on which he made his first watch.
Do you still have that lathe today?
Of course I do.
and this is the lathe that he made his first watch with?
Yeah.
That's extraordinary.
So that is very nice. Now, you may ask, why would George want to take me under his wing? He'd spent a lot of time with me. He'd come over and look at what I was doing and comment and guide me, and I would go to him when necessary. But why would he want to take it? Well, he wanted to rise up in the echelons of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers. That was important to him, because professionally and otherwise. And he, of course, became the master in the late 70s, I think, or early 80s.
Wow. Fast forward to much more recently, thanks to you, I'm part of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers because you sponsored me. Well, I feel like I'm part of this important lineage. I want to thank you for that.
You're very much part of it, John. You and I have been friends for
a long time.
Quarter of a century almost.
Yes. So one of my favorite stories that you've shared in the past is back in, I think it was August of 71.
Right.
George Daniels...
Yeah, well,
was out. You were working late at night.
We had worked all day.
Mm-hmm.
Julie was away; his wife and daughter were away, and so it was just the two of us. And I suppose 5:30, 6 o'clock came on, and George wandered over and he said, "William, are you close to being done?" And I said, "Yeah, 5-10 minutes or so. I can stop." He said, "Right, it's my birthday. I'm 45 today." And he said, "Here's £20. I want you to go out and buy a bottle of whiskey and fish and chips." £20 was a massive sum of money then. I was terrified even carrying it. But I went down to the local fish and chip shop and found a liquor shop to buy the whiskey and came back. And we had a wonderful time chatting about things. And I learned more about him then, things that would never have sort of come up otherwise, such as the fact he played the mouth organ and the accordion, and he had a huge love of opera. He used to go and queue up, be at an opera if it was right up in the wings. He wouldn't want to be there. But he had these great passions, and he was a remarkable man. And we developed a very great friendship. I never became the watchmaker that maybe he thought once upon a time I might become, but because it was never my area. There's a very important lesson everyone needs to know, and that is what is good. It's frightfully important because that's your benchmark.
What is good?
What is good? Anthony Randall had for his chronometer work, he had a little detent, which he kept on his bench. It was made around 1920 by a man called Hood. And to Anthony, it sort of was the epitome of excellent workmanship. Polished all round, burnished beautifully. And so he thought, if I can get close to that, I'll be doing very well. And George's work was fantastic. And you learn a lot from that. If you don't know what is good, and I learned this from other people I worked with, they've worked incredibly hard to where they are. And to know what is good and know what you should strive for and know how to finish things and how they should look and the design of things. If you look back at history and you think, well, why do I like that? Because it's so beautifully balanced. We're surrounded by lots of things when we look at them sometimes and say, gosh, that's beautiful. But then if you say, why is that beautiful? And it's because it has a certain balance. It may be the materials, it may be the finish. And these are things which are so important.
I find that those are beautiful words. And thanks for sharing that. What is good? Because so many people important. Today, the first question is, what's it worth?
Yeah.
Which is the wrong question.
Yeah.
Is it good?
Yeah. Its value will fluctuate. with time, with fashions of the time. But it'll never change if it's good. People will always look at it and say, wow, you know.
Can you share another lesson of life that George Daniels taught you? Maybe through a story or something that comes to mind.
He built a new workshop. When I started working with him in 1970, his workshop was in the bedroom upstairs. And on the Thursdays when I came, he would go downstairs. He'd be working on his book on Breguet. And he did all his own drawings. So many of your listeners may have that book on Breguet. It's a wonderful book.
Classic.
It's a classic book. So he would come up occasionally and find out how I was doing. And then after a year or so, he built a new workshop. And he had the workshop above and his garage down below for cars. And one day, toward the end of my time with him in 1972, he said, "William, come on down. I've got something to show you." And here was a 1907 Hispano Suiza, a wonderful classic car. He said, "It's yours for £5,000. And
what did you say?
Well, I didn't have a car.
Yes.
I didn't have £100 to my name. But you know, for a second, whenever you're offered something, you're dreaming. Where could I put it? Well, Mum and Dad wouldn't be very pleased with this. I can't even drive it, you know. But it had gas headlights and everything. He collected some fabulous cars. A couple of years later, I took him to Glyndebourne. Have you heard of Glyndebourne?
No.
It's the most wonderful place where opera is performed every summer. And it's a very exclusive place. And I thought, I want to thank George for his great kindness to me. So I took him and his wife to Glyndebourne. And George said, "Well, I'll drive." Well, Glyndebourne is the kind of place where everyone goes in their smartest possible vehicles and dresses to the nines, and you have a picnic on the grass by the lake. And what would George do? He brought his Bentley, and he sort of outshone everybody. That was typical George.
I love it.
Yeah.
Oh, I have so many questions about George Daniels, but I'm going to move on because your life just gets more and more interesting as it goes on. And in the 70s, you suddenly won this competition. This is after your George Daniels time with the Royal Mint.
Right.
What happened and what did you create to win this contest?
I'd been teaching at Eton, although that didn't have a lot to do with it. I was invited to a banquet at the Goldsmiths Hall, and I met someone there who sort of was intrigued by the work I was doing, the design work, and said, there's a competition coming up for the tercentenary of the Old Royal Observatory. They're going to commission a medal. Would you like to enter the competition? So I said, I'd love to. And I went back and I worked and trying to find something that would work really well. And I came upon in my studies an edict of King Charles II, which gave his reasons for founding the observatory. And one of them was for finding the longitude at sea, and then perfecting navigation and perfecting astronomy.
Which is always on your mind.
Which is always on my mind. I produced, instead of one medal, I produced drawings for 3 medals and linked them together. The obverse was a picture of the observatory. And then the 3 reverse things were John Harrison's timekeeper and the sextant that Captain Cook used on his voyage, and then an armillary sphere, which is a teaching tool for astronomy. And I did my drawings down at Greenwich. I'd go down there quite often. And there was Derek Howes, Commander Derek Howes, looked after the observatory at that time. And the clockmaker was a man called Richard Good, who you may have heard.
Of course, another famous book. About, Richard Good, yes.
And Richard wanted to take up a post at the British Museum. And so he was preparing to leave, and we were working on an exhibition for the 300th anniversary of the observatory. And he said, "Will, come and help me, can you?" And so I was working on a part-time basis. And when he left, Derek Howes said, "Would you like to continue working on a part-time basis?" And so I worked 2 days a week there, 3 days a week, and then 2 days a week teaching at Eton. So it was an idyllic life in a way.
And then you become the keeper of clocks at the Royal Observatory and then the National Maritime Museum. And I hate to fast forward over a decade of your life, but you end up coming to America.
I do, but I must fill in one little detail. Being at Greenwich gave me an opportunity to promote Harrison.
Yes.
Harrison in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, although his work was well known through Gould and Quill, he was considered by many good horologists as a glorious dead end.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't think that his work went anywhere because if you look at the modern marine timekeeper, you would think, well, how does this relate? Well, in fact, the very size of the chronometer is based on H4 and other features. And there are several features which I won't get into now. So the opportunity came up in 1976. It was going to be the bicentenary of Harrison's death.
Mm-hmm.
And I approached Derek Howes to suggest that we put on an exhibition at Greenwich of all of Harrison's known work at that time. And we got everything under one roof except for the Brocklesby Park tower clock, which we didn't think we could remove and bring.
Logistics.
But it was a very important exhibition in promoting Harrison. And a tragedy happened because when I came back, and I'll get back to my visit to America and Seth Atwood, I ran into the publicist and the publicist for the observatory, for the National Maritime Museum. I made an innocent question saying, how's the publicity for the exhibition coming on? And she turned to me and said, it's none of your business.
Wow.
I thought,
what happened?
What have I done? And it turned out that the museum had made a deal with the Sunday Times newspaper that no publicity for the Harrison exhibition or any other exhibition at Greenwich should take place while the Sunday Times exhibition of the Declaration of Independence was on. So it was the Declaration of Independence that did away with the
That's
Harrison
scandalous.
Well, anyway, it was, and the two sort of relate in a way, so they could have gone side by side, but I was so devastated. And at this time, this wonderful man, Seth Atwood, was saying, come and work for me. And I thought, and if everything was changing in England at the time, and I thought, this is an opportunity I shouldn't miss.
So let's talk about Seth Atwood and the Time Museum, which brought us together eventually. But
indeed. Well,
take us back to what happened.
It was about 1975, and Derek Howes called me to his office and said, I'd like you to meet a very wealthy American collector. Could you join us for lunch? It ended up, anyway, with Derek couldn't come in the end, so I just went on my own. And I remember being told a couple of things. Number one was to meet at the Trafalgar pub, which is down at the bottom of the hill at Greenwich. And the other was that these were two very, very wealthy Americans. And so I thought, what does a wealthy American look like? And, we had seen in London a lot of the sort of hippies came over and Jimi Hendrix and all those. So what would very wealthy American, I immediately sort of got an image of the sort of Westerns and things like that. Big brimmed hat and
the cowboy hat and the boots.
Yeah, exactly. So I walked into the Trafalgar pub and there was no one looking like that at all. And I told the maitre d', and the maitre d' said, yes, of course, please come with me. And Mr. and Mr. Atwood were sitting very quietly in a corner, beautifully dressed, absolutely charming, and we hit it off right away. And a few months later, he said, would you like to come on a busman's holiday after Christmas? So I went over there for 3 weeks and had the most wonderful time.
Now, was the museum built at that point in time?
The museum opened. He began collecting in 1968. By 1970, he was buying the Orville Hagen's collection, which was a museum in Denver, Colorado. They moved the museum to another location in 72. When I came in 75, there were about 1,275 pieces in the collection. And this was the Time Museum. He also had his private watch collection. He kept those at home because people could share them. He could show them to people. You can't see a watch really behind a piece of glass in a showcase. He invited me to see the collection, and I remember sitting there. with a glass of champagne being plied. Here's the Henry Graves watch. Here's the special watch I had Patek Philippe make for me.
Oh, the secular perpetual calendar.
Exactly. And this was the kind of thing he loved. And he had the wherewithal to buy whatever he wanted at whatever price. And I'd never experienced anything like this before.
So
it took the horological world by surprise.
For a decade, you were curator of the most important and largest, arguably, horological museum ever assembled.
Well, it was the fastest growing. And what was so wonderful about it is that Mr. Atwood came up with the idea when he was, it's about 1965, 67, 68. He read a lot and he thought, he'd had the sort of idea of, he wanted to examine time. Time was a fascinating subject to him. So he decided to put this collection together. He looked up the names of the most famous makers in history. So you imagine doing this in art, all right? You're going to put together an art collection. And so you need a Giotto, a Cimabue, you need a Velázquez, you need a Michelangelo, a Leonardo, a Constable, a Gainsborough. Or we go through the whole history of painting. Simple. You've got your list of 100, and so off he goes to London. And he goes to the dealers and he says, look, I'm building this museum. These are examples. I want examples by all these makers, but I want really first-rate examples. No one had ever heard of anyone building a collection like this at the time. And they all thought he was crazy. And then Robert Fuchs took him seriously, and that's when he bought his first watch and paid a record price for it, but it was the beginning of a wonderful journey for him.
And there are so many stories of Mr. Atwood paying record prices, way more than anyone else during that era. Yep. And in retrospect, they were always bargains, which is very interesting from a collector's
Well, he had this, I knew what the dealers were making of him. I had to confront him one day and I said, do you know what's happening at these auctions? They're ringing the auctions and the price you're paying is way above the hammer price.
So do you think even at that time, the auctions were being rung to make him pay more?
Oh, yes.
This is just...
Without a question.
Wow.
They would go off, I don't want to mention any names, but they'd go off to dinner afterwards and they would have a private auction over dinner. Usually Eugene Geschwind would end up buying it. And he was a Swiss dentist, actually, but a brilliant dealer. But there was something that I learned, and I've learned since then, because I resented this at first, because here was this charming man who was almost like a father to me. And I loved him. I thought he was a wonderful person. I couldn't bear the idea of him being taken for a ride, with his generosity. But he knew, and I came to know, that without the trade, you couldn't do it. So you could never have built the collection without all the dealers and other people who were offering him pieces to be able to achieve what he wanted to achieve. So the collection grew from about 1,275 pieces to around 4,000 during the time I was there.
Can you share how Mr. Atwood made his money?
I would be delighted to. His dad bought at the Atwood Vacuum Machine Company, they made vacuum machines for factories. So they were big central vacs for factories. He was quite successful, and around 1916, he bought a Buick, and the Buick had a rattly door. Well, being a very clever man and good thinker, he designed a door bumper to stop the door from rattling. And he was quite pleased with it, and he took it to the chief engineer at General Motors in Detroit. And the chief engineer said, well, 1916, we're in production here. We can't fit that on our car. And the next model that came out had the door bumper without the, going around the patent. And he was so appalled by this that he sat for 3 days outside the chairman's office and got his first contract. And that was the beginning of automotive hardware, which is what the company made its fortune from. Atwood took over the company after the war. This is Seth Atwood. This was the son, Seth G. Atwood. He took over the company and he expanded it into banks and He invented the first dollar-changing machine and other things like this.
So persistence and genius.
Yes.
Persistence and genius.
He had this idea, which I found so refreshing, whereas at Greenwich and places here, they were saying, why? He would say, well, why not? And that was that attitude that I found in America that I found so refreshing. Why not? What's wrong with that? Let's explore it. Maybe it's not right, but let's try it.
Here at Collectability, we're a bit obsessed with Patek Philippe, and we're especially obsessed with the Henry Graves Supercomplication, arguably one of the most important Patek Philippe watches ever made. And Seth Atwood was the one that eventually bought it from the family. Can you share, because you could set the record straight, how did Mr. Atwood buy the Supercomplication?
Well, through reading and his connections and everything, he heard of its existence, and he met the owner, whose name you will know.
Reginald Fullerton. Pete Fullerton.
Pete Fullerton for a long time. That was kept a very closely guarded secret. But anyway, he lived on Rhode Island?
Yes, he was in Watch Hill, Rhode Island.
Right.
And was the grandson of Henry Graves.
Seth Atwood went out and met him and talked about the watch. And whenever he was out east, he would go and see Pete Fullerton. And they got on very well. It just went on for a long time. And I know Alan Banbury at Patek was after this for a long time. And there were other people who were. They went to see Pete Fullerton. They were always on about the watch. Well, one day Seth Atwood went and had dinner with Pete Fullerton, and they never mentioned the watch. Atwood didn't want to bring it up. He was just enjoying Pete Fullerton's company. Mm-hmm. Pete Fullerton had never experienced anything like this before. Everyone had been, what about the watch now? And they were having whiskeys late at night. And Pete Fullerton apparently turned and said, I will sell you the watch. He said, but I want cash. And I want it in the morning. And can you do that? Atwood said, fine. He went back to his hotel, got up in the morning, and went into the local bank. And apparently he went up to the cashier, because he was very open this way. And he said, I can't remember how much it was going to cost. It was a substantial sum of money. And he told the cashier, I need to draw this amount of money, cash. And of course, the girl behind the desk thought, I'm sorry, I have to see the manager. So she went to see the manager, and they looked out of the window and saw Mr. Atwood, and he looked the part. So anyway, he invited Seth Atwood into the office, and they were sitting down. And he said, well, Mr. Atwood, I need to, first of all, know that you are you, and secondly, can you afford it? And he said, well, that's fine. He said, call this number. Call this man Lauren Graham in Rockford. And so the bank manager called, and the phone answered, said, it's United Bank of Illinois, and can I speak to Lauren Graham? And anyway, so put it through. And the bank manager said to him, I have a gentleman sitting in front of me. He's very well dressed, but I need to know that he is who he says he is. He says his name is Seth Atwood. He's wearing a nice suit, beautifully dressed. He said he's carrying a can of Coke and he's smoking a cigarette. He said, Lauren Graham said, yes, that's Seth Atwood.
That's him.
That's him.
He always had the Coke.
Yeah, I always had the Coke and the cigarette. This was early in the morning. And so he said, well, now I need to know, can he afford it? And he said, well, he owns this bank.
That's one answer that always gets you, the cash. Yeah. Wow, it was a different time.
Yeah.
And he walked out of there with a suitcase of cash.
But a nicer person. I loved Seth Atwood. And his wife, Pat, was very special. She sort of created the ambiance of the museum. They worked together on it. And their children were charming, too. So it was a marvelous 10 years of my life.
Now, I remember asking, before he passed away in the late 90s, I asked Seth Atwood, why did he do it? Why did he collect? And I want to see if you asked that question, and why do you think Seth Atwood collected?
Because he was fascinated by the subject of time. Mm-hmm. What is time? St. Augustine said, if someone asks me, I know, but if you ask me to explain, I don't. And he was sort of interested in the whole concept and its impact on our lives. And he thought it would be a very interesting exercise to create a collection of artifacts that described how time measurement developed over the years. So he was focusing on one aspect of time, which is its measurement.
So indeed, it's no surprise that Seth Atwood was obsessed with time measurement, and it's something that we're all so familiar with, this obsession, this common obsession that we have. So Will, what is your definition of time?
John, I'm very pleased you asked me that question.
And we're going to have to wait for part 2 to hear your answer. This is the end of part 1 of our conversation with Will Andrews. And you're going to have to join us in the next episode for part 2 to hear the answer from Will of what is time, and also explore what this beautiful object sitting before us actually is. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe so that you do not miss a future episode. This is John Reardon for Collectability.